So welcome everyone to this 7th webinar in the Earth Science Information Partners Data to Action webinar series. This webinar, which will continue throughout the rest of the year, follows ESIP's 2019 theme of increasing the use and value of earth science data and information, which was one of several goals identified in ESIP's most recent strategic plan. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to YouTube following the webinar. Oops. Sorry, I went the wrong way. For more than 20 years now, ESIP has helped members of the earth science data community find each other across traditional boundaries and work together. ESIP does this by fostering rich collaborative experiences, including 2 annual in-person meetings, numerous community-driven virtual collaborations around common data challenges, and through seed funding to further data interoperability. ESIP is funded by NASA, NOAA, and the USGS, and currently has more than 120 partner organizations spanning the federal, private, and academic sectors, as well as many more individual participants. ESIP's vision is to be a leader in promoting the collection, stewardship, and reuse of earth science data, information, and knowledge that is responsive to societal needs. By connecting people across the data lifecycle and across sectors, ESIP helps people to leverage their collective expertise and technical capacity to address challenges related to the creation, management, distribution, and analysis of earth science data. Today, for our webinar, we welcome Dr. Carol Song to talk about an extensible geospatial data framework, GeoEDF, for fair science. Dr. Song is Senior Research Scientist and Director of Scientific Solutions in the Rosen Center for Advanced Computing at Purdue University. Her current research interests include high performance and distributed computing, data cyber infrastructure, and science gateways. She has had a leading role in many federally funded interdisciplinary and cyber infrastructure programs. Dr. Song has funded and mentored more than 60 graduate and undergraduate students over the years and serves as a mentor through programs such as Women in HPC and Practice and Experience in Advanced Research Computing and Supercomputing. Before joining Purdue, she worked in industry for more than 10 years leading software product development and participating in creating medical imaging standards. She received her PhD degree in computer science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Song will be assisted by Rajesh Kalyanam, a research scientist at Purdue University, who is also system architect of GeoEDF. So before I ask Carol to take it away, I want to let you all know that you can feel free to put questions in the chat box during the presentations, or there will be time at the end for you to unmute yourself and ask them. So I will now pass the screen share. Carol, should I pass it to you?
Yes, please.
All right. Looks great.
Okay, do you see the full screen, right? Okay. Hello, everybody. I really appreciate having this opportunity to talk about our project, get the word out, and really excited. And just to kind of clarify, Rajesh will actually do some of the heavy lifting, so my appreciation to him. So this just a quick word about this project we call GeoEDF. It represents extensible geospatial data framework towards fair science, and that's our goal, to help researchers to be more fair. And the main idea is to use this framework to help data-driven sciences to be findable, to be more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. This has been funded by the NSF's new program, CSSI, Cyber Infrastructure for Sustained Scientific Innovation. And we got awarded for the data framework track, and it's going to be 5 years. And we're right around the end of the first year. And so a quick list of the leaders of the project. So I'm the PI on the project. I'm really on the cyber infrastructure side. And this team consists of 4 domain scientists. You can see from this list, they come from different domains, including people from Purdue's agricultural and biological engineering, civil engineering, and agriculture economics. And Jack Smith is actually from West Virginia University. He's working with various government agencies on water quality and resource management. And so what I'll do is I'll give a quick overview of the project and going back a little bit to tell you about how we came to this point and sort of parading some of the drivers behind this project, and then give you a high-level overview of what we plan to do. And then Rajesh will dive into a little bit more detail on the technical side on our design and how the direction, how we're going to implement things. And please feel free to ask questions if you have any. So, our group has been working with a lot of domain applications such as modeling, simulations, data analysis, data visualization over the years. And a lot of the data are geospatial, georeferenced, and more so, they come in different shapes and sources and formats and so on. I think those are probably not foreign to this group. For example, a lot of places are making data public from the cities, counties, states. Some of the data appears just a whole bunch of files that people have to navigate through, different formats, and more people are using remote sensing data for all kinds of applications, whether it's from satellite or UAVs. And also in around the people that we're working with, a lot of people are running models and they generate output data. A lot of those are geospatial data, gridded data. And of course, we have the some of the very valuable large data sets available in well-curated, managed repositories. And more data is being collected all over the place. And in this particular example, people are using handheld mobile sensors to get at the plant health information by scanning the leaves of the plant. Let's see. So the challenge is a lot of times it's with the variety of software that you need in order to deal with the data, for example, to process the data in some way, to view the data, and to share the data. So essentially, there are a lot of choices, open source, commercial software. We've probably all gone down some roads, with GeoServer, with QGIS, with, all these other tools that keeps coming up. And so researchers are faced with these issues of, which software do I use? And if I use this one, is it compatible with somebody else's data, or is it in the right format for some other people's tools? So we're faced with all these decisions on a daily basis. So to kind of help with reducing some of the barriers there, we came up with this project that created what we call geospatial data analysis building blocks, essentially software modules and some of the data infrastructure software pieces that allow people to deal with geospatial data more easily without requiring significant amount of GIS expertise. So for that project, that was also funded by NSF about 5 years ago. And so for that, we built these geospatial capable software modules on top of Hub 0, which is you can think of it as a portal framework or very often these days people call them science gateways. So HubZero is a ready-to-use and open source software stack that you can start your own website that support many collaborative features. Among them is the way to deliver interactive simulation tools in a web browser. So users do not have to download anything, but it lacked support for geospatial data. So with our GAPS project, we added the geospatial data handling capabilities inside HubZero. And so we built on a bunch of open source software, including iRODS, GeoServer, PostGIS, Solar for searching, and also Globus for large data transfer. And this software infrastructure is also capable of connecting to large computational resources, such as those in the NSF-funded Exceed cyber infrastructure, and also can connect to campus clusters, such as those at Purdue. And so with this bundle of all the software, people can build science gateways, portals for collaboration, for delivering simulation tools or visualization tools to a broader audience. And one of the gateways we build is this represented by the circle. We call it My GeoHub, which I'll talk a little bit more later. So through the GAPS project, we delivered these building blocks. One of them is an integrated data management environment with built-in geospatial data support, and which I'll give you some examples later. And also some tools that requires no programming. People can view geospatial data, different formats of data, and also some toolkits for rapid application development. Again, it doesn't require deep GIS programming expertise and web programming expertise. And to be able to interoperate with other cyber infrastructures or third-party applications, we created data service APIs for people to put data in and also access data. And so all of these things are also made available through publication of data and tools with digital object identifiers. And again, the goal is to make these all very easy to use and replicate. So with all of these capabilities, we worked with applications in different domains represented by these pictures, such as various science gateways for food sustainability, for hydrologic modeling, for agriculture decision support, and so on, and also for training. So a few examples just to give you a sense of what under GAPS, what we delivered. So essentially, for data management, you can think of it as a file explorer or finder kind of tool that you upload files, and with the files in there, you can view very detailed metadata. You can also change the metadata, update it, and add fields if you want. And also to be able to visualize, especially the geospatial data. So here is an example. You can just select the files and click preview, and you can see these different layers and looking at detailed information on the features. So these are things that we see being very useful to people, so they don't have to install any extra software. They just upload the data, and they can share data in a more interactive fashion. Another example is with this data platform, then people can do these workflows, kind of stringing together a set of steps all on the web platform For example, here you can, this is an example where people upload a set of data, and then they, other people or people in the group around the project, they can look at the data and load them automatically into tools by open with, here's a specific tool called multispec that can be used to process geospatial data. So in this example, the processing is to do a subset and crop out a specific area, and the data can be saved back into this data platform, and then right away the data is becoming available to other tools or other people who may want to use it downstream. And this screen shows a number of tools that have been developed using some of these building blocks. The multispec that I mentioned earlier for geospatial data processing, it can do a bunch of things, including classification of different kinds. And here's a tool that shows that can run model simulations on HPC systems, and then the results can be analyzed through different input, and people can drill down into the details to look at the values of specific regions. And also tools for accessing remote data repositories through a more usable fashion, where people don't have to dig through, tens of thousands of files. Rather, they can access things through selection of a bunch of variables and just get the data they want. And also, while they're accessing the data is being made more usable by, aggregating to the right level as they desire. So these are some examples that we as part of the delivery from that project. And a word about data publication. So this is the one capability of the platform where data sets can be published with a lot of information in addition to just a bundle of files. And what's more, the data sets, once published, it'll be automatically assigned DOI, and also the built-in tracking of usage. In this case, it would be download. So the researchers themselves don't have to worry about building in their own website to track these things. So this is a website that I mentioned earlier. We call it a science gateway, which is built on HubZero with the GAPS software building blocks installed. So this is an instance of the software that we created. The software itself can be used by other people to create their own website. So now that's where we are right now. We can see the quick user adoption of what we have developed. We gathered it's because there is a high barrier to a lot of people, especially people from interdisciplinary teams, to use geospatial data. So we are helping quite a number of funded projects, all hosted on this one science gateway, and you can see the usage number over the past year. But still, as we're working with researchers, one major issue is these what we call data wrangling. So this picture kind of represents the pretty chaotic workflow that people encounter every day. So essentially, what we're trying to capture here is the what we often hear people talking about. In order to make the data usable for their model, for their analysis tool, they have to go through many steps to prepare the data. So they may have to access different data repositories to get the right data set. They they have to use some desktop tools to process the data, subsetting or reprojecting, or doing necessary transformation, and they may access HPC systems to do significant computation, and eventually they probably reach out to some portal or science gateway to publish, share their data or tools. So all of that wrangling actually sometimes it's like maybe 80% of their time and students' time to get the data ready. And so we sort of summarize the challenges a lot of people are facing. The first one is, it's a manual workflow. You work on different platforms and go through different steps, and those are not very easily captured. Coding and to collect data, acquire data, and processing requires a lot of software knowledge. And we all know how graduate students code, right? So it's very, very rarely reproducible and even findable. Literally, you can't find their code. So this is kind of what we gathered from our just daily interactions with researchers. And so one example of what they have to go through, even just for making use of one data set, they're really very meticulous. This is actually one of the sessions we did with our science collaborators to kind of dig into exactly what they need to do to make that data usable in their calculation. And another example is we were working with one of our collaborators. There is this really nice and clean workflow chart. But when we go into deeper, have this really in-depth discussion, we found out, there are all these, format conversions, different software packages, and even very often different platforms like operating systems that they have to use in order to use specific software, and to get all of that together, eventually make them ready to use in a model. So that's a lot of details, a lot of steps to go through. And so we, continuing in our gaps, the spirit of gaps to lower barriers, we had this vision of GeoEDF, which we want to create an extensible geospatial data framework that can help create seamless connections between platforms, data, and tools. And so one key, I guess our key goal is to make data sets usable directly in scientific models. So to really significantly reduce the time to, we like to call time to science. So to reduce the time researchers need to put in data wrangling in order to get to their research steps. So all of what we're doing for GeoEDF, we have the goal of helping people to make their research more fair. So here's really the vision after GeoEDF. We're not there yet. We're starting, but it's good to keep these goals in mind. At the end, we want to get to the point where people can go to one place and basically define what they want to do, and then ask the system to execute their workflow, and then the data and their workflow are all captured, the process of the provenance captured, metadata captured automatically, and to make what they do more reproducible. So that's really the goal in the end. Let's see. I have a high-level picture of what GeoEDF encompasses. So there are these, in the middle, you see these 4 boxes. So these are the key components, or 5 things. These are the key components. So essentially, we're again building on some of the successful and popular public open source software, and also again providing the connections to HPC resources and some of the commonly used libraries and visualization tools. And so the key components of GeoEDF includes data connectors, which help people to connect to data sources, whether it's local or remote, and data processors that help prepare the data, and also integrating all these things into what we call active learning, basically interactive and use of real-world large data sets in training and education, and also interoperability with other cyber infrastructures. And so all of that, and we start with a number of data sources. These are not the complete list, but it's a good set to start with. So some of these are like HydroShare is another cyber infrastructure that we would actually access more than data, but data definitely is one of the things that we're connecting them with. Let's see. And as far as deliverables, we're going to produce a bunch of software open source packages that are installable on other platforms. Our science partners will produce their workflow that's useful to their communities, and also demonstrating how the GeoEDF can be used by scientists. And we're also making enhancements on the facilities for data publication for courses, especially because we found that science gateways have been very useful in teaching and training, and that's a significant application for us. And obviously, we want to reach to the broadest community, and ESIP has been a great partner. Aaron Robinson, the ESIP executive director, is on our advisory board, and when we wrote the proposal, we were hoping she would help us to get the word out and also help us integrate with some of the ESIP training opportunities. Let's see. So just quickly, we are at the end of year one. We're just beginning second year. We had a successful stakeholder workshop just 2 weeks ago. And we've gotten a lot of useful feedback that will go into our planning in year two. So even though we have these releases planned, but it's going to be highly iterative, and we will release, because it's modularized, and we also claim it's extensible, and we have all the intention and plan to make things extensible. So we'll release pieces as they become available, and engage users, potential users, to try them out and collaborate. So at year 4 and 5, we're going to have the official releases and expand our collaborations with a broader community. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Rajesh to talk about the design and directions for implementation.
This is Rama. Is it okay to ask you a question at this point?
Sure.
Yeah, the question is, I think I've heard both the terms in the presentation. One is making data fair for the purposes of people who use the data, for the researchers, and making the research itself fair. I think you're talking about both. Is that correct?
Right, right. Yeah, we see, data obviously ESIP talks a lot about fair data, and we also think the research, I guess we look at it as some sort of workflow, right? You have a process with data-driven process. So that's the part we're really talking about to help make that findable, reusable, reproducible.
Okay, so it's both the results of the research that are fair.
Right.
That will be made fair. Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you. If there are no other questions, Rajesh will start.
All right. Hello, everyone. I hope you can see my screen. So I was just going to touch a bit on the design and cyber infrastructure. So as Carol mentioned, this is still very early stages on this project. So I'm going to be focusing primarily on things we've accomplished so far. And they are the most important things as well, because they'll be getting into the data connectors and processors that Carol mentioned. And so those are, I think, our most, I would say, novel contributions to this. So I wanted to start first with just another sort of recap of a typical workflow that someone would have probably built in the past. And this is an actual Jupyter.
Rajesh, can I interrupt you for a second? I do believe that the slides are advancing. I think it's frozen right now.
Are you on the full screen?
Can you see it now?
Maybe let's stop screen sharing for a second and try again.
Okay, all right.
Great, that looks much better.
All right. So I wanted to start with, again, an example of an actual tool that was built a couple of years back by one of our grad students. And so this tool was intended to make it easier to work with different Earth observation data products that's distributed by NASA and USGS. So as you can see, there's a bunch of different data products listed here in this drop-down list. And the goal was to obtain HDF files from these different data sources, provide a shapefile boundary of a watershed, and then compute a weighted aggregate, as this call out here says. So during the development of the tool itself, the student initially focused on the first two data sets, the two MODIS data sets, and then later on he extended his code to support SMAP, which is soil moisture, and then a few other products. And so, as you all know, when you're actually building these tools, and as Carol sort of mentioned before, you initially start with some code, and then as you have to add new things, you don't go back and redesign it, you just add on to that. So you just tag on additional files or additional code to sort of implement these things. And so we ended up with essentially code that was a bit modular, but then it also had several different hard-coded URLs to these data sets. And the slide here sort of points those. So for example, the MODIS evapotranspiration data, that's the first one, may be found in this particular repository. This SMAP is in this other repository. And so yeah, this third repository. And so the common thread among all these different things is that each of these are essentially just websites selling files. The other common thread is they're all related to NASA Earth data. And so you have to actually have an Earth data login before you can actually access some of these files. And so the first step is to go through the whole authentication protocol, establish your authentication with Earth data, get an authorization token, and then use that to access these data sets. So there's clearly a lot of scope for improvement here and more modularity and reusability of this code. So when you actually drill down and look into the actual data set itself, there's quite a lot of information that's conveyed in the URL to this data set. So you have different pieces here. So one of them is the actual year that the HDF file comes from. There's the day of the year, and then since this is a MODIS data set, some of you may be familiar with that. The HDF files are actually captured for each MODIS grid, which is just a rectangular matrix, and that sort of overlays across the world, and then that's how the MODIS sensors are capturing this data and storing it. And so say you're running a particular simulation, you might be interested in just capturing data for a few years or accessing data for a few years and then running a simulation on those years and then rerunning your model again on maybe a larger time scale as well. You might also be interested in working with different shape files. And so since you're interested in just getting the data for your region of interest, the set of Modis grids that you're actually accessing would be different each time. And so even though the data is coming from the same repository, if you want to say run the same simulation for different timescales or different input files, then you have to be able to write code that can seamlessly sort of pull in the data that's needed for your particular use case. And so there's a lot of scope for generality there. The other example is again code that another student wrote, and this is a bit more modular. As you can see, there is a function here that's trying to get the elevation data from USGS, and then there's a bunch of different operations happening after that. So you have a bunch of different raster files that are then merged together. You have to reproject it to maybe your input shapefile of interest and then clip it to that to the data. And all of this, again, as you can tell, is just pre-processing. So we haven't even gotten to the actual science yet, as Carol mentioned before. So here again, there's a pretty easy story to tell. You can split this whole operation into several different pieces. Maybe one separate piece is just getting the elevation data from USGS. That's completely independent from a process that is actually just reprojecting shapefiles. And this isn't even domain specific, so anyone from any other domain can use code that's written to explicitly just reproject a particular shapefile. And then you have several different common raster processing operations. So just sort of quickly getting back into what connectors and processors are. So connectors are essentially our idea of how we can make it easier to access these remote data sets. So you shouldn't have to have a grad student spending their time on actually writing the code to do the authentication to NASA's data login. They shouldn't have to figure out how to use HTTP GET or POSTs. I mean, it's probably a good skill to know, but then they shouldn't be spending the majority of their time working on that. So connectors essentially are sort of designed to help you access these remote data sets that might be using different protocols, as is listed here on the right-hand side. So they could just be simple HTTP websites. They could be an FTP server. You could have OpenDAP, which allows you to essentially partition and get pieces of netcdf data and threads and so on. So as you can see, they are sort of intended to abstract the implementation of these different protocols. You would essentially interact with the connector by just providing it the data set you're interested in and a few other information like authentication and the specific maybe time period and things like that. And then that sort of abstracts away the actual implementation of how the data is accessed and brought down to your work site, essentially. So based on discussions with our different science partners, we've come up with a few different data sources that we will build connectors for out of the box. So again, as Carol mentioned, this is intended to be an extensible project and framework. So we certainly want to be building all of the possible connectors to different data sets. We have, as this table shows, a pretty comprehensive set of things that we will begin with, just based on things that are popular and used in most scientific workflows. And I guess certainly this is, again, something that if you have any ideas, we'd be happy to hear those as well. And so you can see a bunch of different national organizations, NASA, USGS, USDA, and a few other organizations as well. And so out of the box, the framework will have connectors for each of these different repositories and data sources. Processors, on the other hand, are the actual code that transforms these data that you've downloaded or retrieved from a connector, and then transform it for use in your actual scientific workflow. So they can be things like reprojecting a shapefile or mosaicing a raster, clipping a raster with a shapefile. So the most common typical geospatial operations. But then they can also be things that are domain specific, but then maybe important enough that we want to make them separate reusable modules that other people can use. So for example, here you have the few domain independent processing operations, In hydrology, there's a few important flood models that people typically use, and so that would be its own separate processor that uses appropriate input and then generates the desired output. Again, there's a few other models in resource sustainability as well, and a big task in resource sustainability is often considering the effects of global changes on local resources like water or crops or other resources. And so there's a lot of downsampling and upscaling and downscaling and aggregation happening there. And so those are the most common processing operations that we will be providing for that particular domain. Before I get into the workflow composer, I just want to skip ahead and talk a bit about the implementation, and then I'll come back to the workflow. So when we look back again at the connector, so the connector is intended to essentially bring in data from a remote repository and then abstract the implementation itself. And so when we think again about our use case and the workflow example that I showed you right at the beginning, you are essentially getting data from a NASA Earth data repository, and there's different ways that you can actually filter that data right at the source itself. So you might only want to retrieve data, say, for a few particular set of years. For example, here we are interested in soil. Say we are interested in soil moisture data for just for the years 2000 to 2005, and so we want to separate out that perspective or that parameter for this data access from the actual implementation of the protocol itself. And so the connector essentially consists of three different pieces. So the input piece of a connector is actually implementing the protocol. Say it's HTTP, it's implementing the HTTP protocol, downloading data from the NASA DAC archive. The filter is essentially affecting this input piece by providing various pre-filtering operations. So before I even go to retrieve the data from the DAC, I can decide what kind of data I want based on the way the filter is configured. And this will be a little more clearer when I show you an actual example of one of these connectors. So this, again, is a connector that was written for the first, I think it's the MODIS evapotranspiration data, if I'm not wrong. So as you can see, there are two different pieces in this case, the input and the filter. And each of the connector pieces, input, filter, and output, will be implemented as Python classes. And so the framework essentially is just a new Python package that anyone can install and then use in their own cyber infrastructure resources. So the NASA input class is essentially just implementing an HTTP protocol operation to get the data from the NASA DAC. It does a few more things, like actually authenticating against Earth data, and then using the token from there. And that's the reason you have a user and a password field as well for the authentication. But as you can see from here, the data that you want is at that particular URL. So you can configure this connector to retrieve data from any NASA DAC website or repository that you're familiar with. And so you would just put in the URL to the data set, but then you can parameterize the URL so that the input, the NASA input connector is essentially just bringing down the files that you're really interested in. So for example, in this case, we have a variable for where the file is, and the order of operations here is actually in the reverse, because the filter is the one that's run first to sort of figure out what kind of data you're interested in, and then it goes in and then instantiates the file variable in the input, and then the complete URL is constructed, and then you can access the actual file. So as you can see here, the filter is essentially attempting to provide a set of years for which you want the data to be downloaded. And so the file variable is essentially being instantiated by what we call a path filter, which again has another variable inside it for the year, and then those the values for those variables are actually provided by a second filter, which has been given a start and an end date, and it's essentially generating different year values to be filled in for the year variable. And so you would end up with a pattern that has Y 2000 to 2005, which then is actually just a string that's then appended to the end of your URL, and then the NASA input Python class can run and actually fetch the data from there and bring it down to wherever you're running this code from. So this example definition is actually a YAML file, which is just a markup language, just like XML. That's the syntax we use. And so there's essentially two big pieces here. So there's the Python classes that implement the different connector operations, the different protocols to access the files. And then anyone can define a workflow as a YAML file, just like this one here, where they can pick and choose different connectors and different filters, and then essentially design the workflow that they want. And so our hope here, and I guess our goal here, is to make researchers sort of think in terms of these big pieces of a workflow. So what's the data set that I want to access? What's the processing operation that I would run on that data next? And then what's the next processing operation, and so on. So thinking more in terms of an actual research workflow rather than in the nitty-gritty of where the data is and how is it accessed and so on. And so once they get down to the individual steps, then it's just a question of figuring out, okay, is this access already implemented by an existing connector? And if so, what are the arguments I give it to just get the data that I want to use in my particular research workflow?
Rajesh, excuse me, in order to leave time for questions, Rajesh, we have a couple of minutes left. Just letting you know.
Okay, yeah, I should be done in like 5 minutes.
Okay.
All right, thank you. So processes, again, are very similar. They are Python classes as well, implementing different processing operations. They can have parameters as well, which, for example, in this case, this is a processor that takes an HDF file and a shape file and then masks the HDF file to calculate aggregates for the different polygons in the shape file. So when you put it all together, you will essentially have a workflow that looks like this, where you can mark the different stages in your workflow and then reference the data that has been produced in a previous step in the next step. So the $1 and $2 are essentially workflow stages. And so the data that's first, the HDF files that have been downloaded through the NASA input connector can now be used in a masking operation. And so really, this is all you would need to be able to re-implement the initial workflow that we saw with the 5 different data sets and the aggregate operation, because once you have these, say, 4 different connectors and processors implemented, then it would just be a matter of reconfiguring these workflows for each of the different data sets and data sources. And you would have complete generality over the number of different years you wanted to run your simulation for, and also the different shape files that or the watersheds that you wanted to run your simulation for. The actual execution of the workflow will run on computational resources and HPC resources, like Carol mentioned before. So the workflow behind the scenes will take care of all the parallelization of your workflow, of the workflow that you've defined. So the framework will say, if you downloaded, say, 5 different HDF files, 1 for each year, then the masking operation will be automatically parallelized and it'll run in parallel as separate jobs. I just wanted to end on how fair science sort of relates to all of this. So once you begin thinking of workflows in the terms of these higher level steps of connectors and processors, then you can actually define your workflow through a declarative file like we've seen before in the YAML format. And so that's, again, a resource or a data file that you can publish onto my GeoHub as well. And so once you have your workflow published to my GeoHub with its appropriate metadata, then anyone can come back and then rerun the workflow and then reproduce your results. The other thing is that since all the data processing and access operations are happening through our framework, we have the capability of actually annotating each of these individual steps in the workflow. So each time data is accessed through a data connector, we have the different parameters that were used to download this data. We can automatically process the files that are downloaded to extract metadata and then store it in our metadata repository as well. And so essentially all the data products are generated through this workflow framework. And so we have more control over implementing various annotation schemes and metadata access and metadata extraction events. And so we can now extract metadata, annotate these different sequences in the workflow, and then save it off so that someone else who's looking for this data or for these workflows can actually find them and reuse them, and essentially be able to get more information or follow the actual sequence of events that happen, rather than having to dig through different pieces of code to be able to reproduce these workflows. So I think we will maybe stop there and open for questions, and then we can talk about other things if we need.
Thank you very much, Rajesh and Carol. Now is the time for questions. So if you have one, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask, or type into the chat box.
Yeah, this is Rama again. I have a question for you. Your connector assumes that you know the file name structure for a given product that you're looking for.
Right.
So it's addressing the A part of FAIR access, but it's not doing any discovery or finding.
Right. Yeah, I didn't really touch on that. I'm sorry, I don't know if you had more questions, but I'll just answer this really quickly.
Yeah,
so I didn't really touch on that. The one thing is that we've been thinking about ideas of accessing so different CIs or cyber infrastructure frameworks like Data1 and Schema.org. They essentially have these standards, and so any repository that essentially follows that standard will be discoverable. And so our hope is that if we can discover other repositories that follow certain fixed metadata schema standards, then we can use that to essentially make those data products discoverable by researchers, and then they can either build connectors to those data products, or in some cases, if it's straightforward, to sort of envision how to access that data. So for example, there are the OAI ORE metadata standard actually allows you to discover a resource, but then also figure out the URL to that resource and then download it. And so if a CI or repository implements the API and provides a REST API that allows you to discover and download data, then that's something that we will implement as well.
I'm sure you're familiar with Earth Data Search right now. And do you have any thoughts on how discovery would work for a particular, you can do keyword and space and time-based searches,
right.
And then you may get a bunch of granules presented to you, and you'll need to download them. So do you have an automation suggestion on what if any changes need to be made in Earth data for making that more easy?
So yes, I actually was talking in one of the previous AGU meetings. I was talking to someone from NASA as well about that. So I think so that's sort of the issue and the opportunity here, because I think Earth data is really great at providing a web interface, like you mentioned, to search for using keywords and timescales and so on. But then if there is an API that allows you to do the same thing, so say I could, once I've authenticated to Earth data, if I can essentially make an API call with a keyword as an argument saying, give me the data sources or the data sets that match this keyword, and then I get a list of essentially URLs, the direct download URLs for the different granules that match that, then you can essentially just because then at that point it's just an HTTP call to get the data, and so we can implement that pretty easily to sort of download all the different granules that have been returned through that search, or maybe just some of them.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that fits the connector framework very nicely. We can just add to it depending on what's needed.
Great. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I guess if there are no questions, maybe Carol, I think she had a few final thoughts on the different opportunities for interoperability. I guess maybe you could just close on that.
Right. So yeah, I thought as unprompted question, I'll just answer that. So we're definitely looking for community engagement in different ways. For example, at this point, we're really eager to hear feedback, such as the earlier question about certain, how whether your connectors would cover these kind of situations, and or data sets that we haven't considered that would be useful to a large group of people. There are collaboration opportunities that we have a number of use cases that we're supporting, but if there are other applications that are going to utilize some of the data connectors, processors on our roadmap, we would definitely like to collaborate and to use the stuff for training, for classroom activities. Those are things that we are also looking for.
Thank you very much, Carol. So I will take the screen share back now and just give a few closing slides. Thank you all for joining us. So I wanted to remind you all that the 2020 ESIP Winter Meeting is now 74 days away. The theme this year, if you don't know already, is putting data to work. You can see the full theme on the screen right now. ESIP meetings bring together the most innovative thinkers and leaders around Earth observation data, and we see a lot of collaborations formed at the meetings. We have an excellent lineup of plenary speakers that will be announced in the next very soon, and a very full agenda of breakout sessions also about to be announced. You can find out more details and register at this link. We also have a number of side events that will be happening, including the Geosemantics Symposium and the ESIP OGC Joint API Coverage Analytics Sprint. So there are many reasons to be excited and to join if you can, and there's also the possibility of remote participation if you can't make it in person. In addition to our in-person meetings, there are many other ways to get involved in ESIP. You can join one or more of the virtual collaborations. You can encourage your organization to become a partner if they're not already. You can learn more and tell others about ESIP using this URL in the bottom right-hand corner. This is a great one-pager about ESIP. The best way to stay in the know, and something I strongly encourage you to do, is to join our Monday update mailing list. It's the best way to find out what's going on in ESIP with very little effort. The next webinar in the Data to Action webinar series will be in November. That'll be November 13th, given by Dr. Leslie Wyborn and ESIP's own Executive Director, Aaron Robinson. The topic will be data for our planet, increasing the use and value of global information infrastructures to support resilient cities, disaster risk reduction, and infectious diseases. You can check our website for more details. Remember, you can access all of the webinar recordings, this one very soon, on the ESIP YouTube channel. So that brings our webinar to a close. I'd like to once again thank Carol and Rajesh and all of you for attending today. We hope to see you at the next webinar and also at the ESIP Winter Meeting.